The leadership team is walking through the latest board deck when someone flips from the revenue slide to the page labeled Data Protection and Privacy. The bullets are clean and simple. They say the company collects only what it needs, uses data for clear purposes, shares it sparingly, and makes it easy for people to delete their information.
Everyone around the table nods, because that story was true when it was written.
But inside the product, reality has changed. A dozen growth experiments, several temporary data pipelines, and a quietly launched machine learning feature have turned that simple privacy story into something no one in the room could confidently defend under scrutiny.
That gap between what you promise about privacy and what your products actually do is where modern trust is lost.
You are listening to a Wednesday headline feature from Bare Metal Cyber magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber. In this story, we treat that gap as a governance and leadership problem, not just a legal or marketing issue.
In high-growth digital businesses, product, data, and growth teams are rewarded for moving fast, measuring everything, and finding new ways to reuse data. Privacy governance usually arrives later, built around policies and notices written for a simpler version of the company.
Over time, leaders may find themselves approving statements about collection, consent, and sharing that no longer match the tangled paths data now takes through tags, third-party tools, internal analytics stacks, and machine learning systems.
Over the next few years, regulators, customers, and boards will care less about how polished your privacy promises sound and more about whether you can prove they are true in production. The core question is not whether your privacy policy sounds reasonable. The real question is whether governance is wired into the way you design, ship, and evolve products.
In a young product company, the first privacy story is often written because someone needs to publish a policy, close a customer, or pass a vendor review. At that moment, the story may match reality. There are a few core features, a small number of vendors, and a simple data model.
Then growth arrives. New markets appear. Experiments multiply. Marketing wants richer attribution data. Data science wants broader training sets. Customer success wants deeper telemetry. The organization optimizes for speed and optionality.
The privacy language stays still while the data reality accelerates away from it. That distance is the trust gap. This gap rarely starts with bad intent. In fast-growing environments, no single person can see the entire picture anymore. Product managers understand their features, but not always the full tracking and enrichment stack behind them. Security teams understand infrastructure and controls, but not every consent detail or user interface pattern. Legal teams manage policies and data protection agreements, but may not see temporary pipelines running in separate cloud accounts.
Each group assumes the company is still roughly aligned with its stated privacy posture, but the evidence behind that assumption may be thin, outdated, or scattered. There are warning signs. People say, "We only use this data to improve the service," while multiple teams are also using the same data for personalization, pricing experiments, and model development. Privacy questions arrive as one-off support tickets instead of triggering deeper design changes. When someone asks whether the company can prove it is doing what it claims, the room responds with intent rather than logs, diagrams, or decision records. At that point, the gap is no longer hypothetical. It is a governance problem waiting to be exposed by a regulator, a plaintiff's lawyer, or a well-informed customer.
Once leaders look beyond high-level architecture diagrams, they usually discover a messier map of where personal data actually lives.
Shadow data appears through practical shortcuts. Teams export data into spreadsheets for quick analysis. They copy production data sets into lower environments for debugging. They spin up side databases for new features. They allow vendors to connect directly to event streams because it gets an experiment live faster. Over time, those copied datasets and side systems become an ungoverned estate. They rarely appear in the privacy risk register. They almost never receive the same lifecycle care as primary systems. When the business later needs to honor a deletion request or prove a retention limit, those forgotten stores become liabilities.
Alongside shadow data sits consent drift.
A few years earlier, the company may have built clear user flows. People were told what was collected, why it was collected, and how to opt out. But as teams add recommendation engines, behavioral analytics, and machine learning features, the purpose of the data quietly expands.
What began as telemetry to keep the service reliable now supports personalization, experimentation, and model training. The consent language, however, still describes the original, narrower purpose.
Even companies that care about privacy often lack a routine for reopening consent and notice design when data is reused in a meaningful new way. Drift happens slowly, one ticket, one launch, and one experiment at a time. Hidden data flows make the problem harder to see. Marketing pixels, mobile software development kits, observability platforms, background synchronization jobs, third-party analytics tools, and feature flags all create pathways where personal data moves beyond the view of most decision-makers.
On paper, the organization may say that personal data is shared only with approved processors under the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, or handled within clear boundaries under the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA. In practice, data may move through dozens of services and vendors, some of which no one has reviewed in years. Until leaders insist on a living, technically grounded view of data flows, shadow data, consent drift, and hidden routes will continue to undermine even sincere privacy promises. Traditional privacy programs often assume governance happens in slow, separate phases. Write a policy, run an inventory, deliver annual training, complete a few impact assessments, then declare the program mature. That model cannot keep up with products that change every day.
Privacy governance that works in a high-speed environment cannot sit on the sidelines as a review function. It has to be embedded into product planning, design, engineering defaults, and release workflows.
The shift is to stop treating privacy as a separate compliance lane and start treating it as a core property of the product, like availability, performance, and security.
In practice, that means moving beyond static checklists. When a product team proposes a feature that uses sensitive data, the process should not simply create a legal ticket. It should trigger a clear review path that includes privacy, security, product, and risk perspectives. That review must also have real authority over go or no-go decisions.
Engineering platforms can help by enforcing patterns such as central consent services, approved tracking libraries, standard experimentation tools, and consistent data classification across systems.
Design and product reviews should include direct questions. What is the stated purpose for this data? Where is that purpose reflected in user-facing language? What happens if a person revokes consent or requests deletion later? Privacy becomes part of the definition of done, not an afterthought before launch. To sustain this at scale, leaders need privacy observability, not just infrastructure observability. They need dashboards and reports that show where personal data is flowing, which systems handle deletion and access requests, and where new uses of data are being introduced without matching updates to notices and controls. Governance metrics should connect to outcomes product and growth leaders care about. How long does it take to launch with compliant designs? How many experiments are running on properly consented data? how many orphan datasets are being reduced over time?
When governance is framed as a way to ship faster with fewer nasty surprises, strong teams are more likely to see it as an enabler rather than a break.
But even good governance patterns will fail if incentives and ownership stay misaligned. That is where privacy theater appears. Privacy theater happens when an organization becomes very good at performing compliance without changing the behavior that creates risk. Training completion looks impressive. Privacy notices are updated on schedule. Policies sit neatly on the internet. But product teams still believe their careers depend far more on velocity and growth than on honoring consent boundaries or limiting invasive data uses.
The organization becomes skilled at looking compliant while staying fragile under hard questions.
Ownership gaps make this worse. Legal may feel it owns privacy because it writes policies and manages regulator discussions. Security may feel adjacent but not responsible because its focus is breach prevention and technical controls. Product and data science leaders may be told they are accountable for privacy, but may lack authority over vendors, data lifecycle decisions, or tracking tools.
The result is that no one clearly owns the moment when a strong revenue story conflicts with a privacy promise.
Instead of hearing, "This crosses a line we committed not to cross," leaders hear, "We will document the risk and move on."
Fixing that requires treating privacy as both a product concern and a trust concern. Significant privacy misalignments should be treated like material product defects, with the same seriousness as major outages or reliability failures. Named executives should have explicit accountability for keeping privacy promises. Their evaluation should include measurable alignment between declared practices and observed behavior. Teams should be recognized for designing privacy-respecting features from the start, not only for last-minute legal and engineering heroics before launch. When career progression, budget, and recognition align with genuine stewardship of user data, the organization can move beyond theater into integrity.
Leaders also need to assume that sooner or later, someone will ask them to prove how personal data has been used. That request may come from a regulator, a court, a strategic customer, or an internal audit committee.
Designing for that moment means treating auditability as a first-class requirement. Auditability starts with purpose and lineage. When a new feature or data use is proposed, leaders should expect a durable statement of purpose tied to specific systems and datasets. Data lineage should show where data comes from, how it is transformed, how it is combined, and where it is shared. You do not need a perfect real-time diagram of every microservice, but you do need enough clarity that someone outside the implementation team can trace how a category of personal data moves through the environment. Decision records matter too. When a company repurposes telemetry for personalization, retains certain events longer for fraud detection, or introduces a new analytics provider, that decision should leave a trail. The record should include risk assessments, approvals, implementation notes, and ties back to the stated privacy posture. Most importantly, leaders should be able to sample production behavior against those decisions. Logs, configuration settings, and vendor contracts should match what was approved. A show-your-work culture does more than prepare the company for enforcement or litigation. It helps the organization learn from its own decisions and correct course before someone else forces the issue.
At its core, this topic is about whether leaders are willing to make privacy promises that match how their products actually behave, not how they wish they behaved.
That boardroom moment, when the privacy bullets no longer feel defensible, is not just a communications problem. It is a signal that growth, experimentation, and governance have drifted apart.
The trust gap opens when data moves faster than the mechanisms that shape and document its use. Closing that gap requires more than sharper legal language. It requires changing how decisions are made, recorded, and enforced across product, data, and risk functions.
The choices that create the gap are often ordinary and rational. A team spins up a pipeline to hit a deadline. Marketing adds tracking to improve growth. Product reuses telemetry to unlock a new feature. Data science looks for more useful training signals.
Those choices are not going away. What can change is the posture around them.
Shadow data, consent drift, hidden flows, and privacy theater can stop being background noise and start being treated as structural risks. Governance can begin to move at product speed. Auditability can become a design goal. Ownership and incentives can align with true stewardship of user data.
The practical move is not to freeze innovation. It is to insist on integrity at the same tempo as growth. That may mean reworking intake and review paths. It may mean redefining executive accountability. It may mean investing in data lineage and decision records that can stand up under real scrutiny. It also means changing the conversation inside leadership teams. Instead of asking whether the organization is compliant as a simple yes or no, leaders should ask where they are most at risk of saying one thing about privacy and doing another. They should also ask what evidence they would show a regulator or strategic customer tomorrow. Those questions, asked regularly and taken seriously, are how privacy promises and product reality stay in the same world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.